So I've come out early this morning. It's probably actually a little too early for me, but I've come to test a new layer that I've been working on for the last few days. And despite the hideous coats of paint and epoxy, there's probably something under there that would be recognisable to the guy who really started one of the world's first giant layer companies, James Hedden. Legend has it that he began carving his layers from broom poles. So I thought I'd follow in some pretty big footsteps and sacrifice my own broom pole and use some basic tools to create my own kind of broomstick layer. I just hope I can catch some fish with it. Rather than sacrifice the shop's longest serving member, I picked up a softwood broom pole at a local DIY shop, and to cut it down to length of 125mm, I used a standard crosscut saw. I held the piece in a bench hook I'd made from some 1/2-inch plywood and attached 2 pieces of 2x1/2 on opposite sides of each end. And this literally hooks onto the bench, and the forward stroke of the saw holds the work in place. Before carving what would be the longer, tapering back end of the layer, I needed to lay down some guidelines. There was no need for me to measure or space the rings accurately. Their job was just as sight guides. With the pencil mounted in a compass, I could also mark some lines around the side. And again, not really following any measurements. I also marked on a stop and start line where I began carving. To shape consistently with the knife, I use the hand that holds it to set the angle, which in this case was fairly shallow. The actual cutting force comes from the thumb pressing against the back of the blade while I'm gripping the pole. I checked the ends as I went, and if it looked consistent, I moved a little further back and just repeated the cuts using the same angle and technique. Once I got some length to the taper, I marked another ring about 1/3 of the way up from the end and started carving again with a slightly steeper angle. When my carving went out a little, I used the end rings as a guide to trim things up. Then I marked 1/3 again and using a slightly steeper angle carried on. Once I'd made the rough cuts, I shaded a band over the places where I made the angle changes, and then made light cuts over these to soften the profile. Changing to a rasp allowed me to refine the shape, working in a similar consistent way, repeating strokes around the handle as I rotated it. I then flipped the rasp over to the finer file on the other side and took out the gouge marks. Finally though, it was down to the sandpaper to give that finer finish, and I used some 120 grit inside half a piece of plastic pipe I'd cut open. For the front end, I wanted to make a round over, so I started out by measuring a little over the radius of the handle and transferring that to the side. I then added a couple more guidelines on the side and some rings to the end. Here I used a steeper 45-degree cut, and because of that I took smaller bites and made more passes. When I was about 2/3 of the way back up towards the last line, I added another line halfway along the taper, and then tilted the blade up somewhere between 60 and 70 degrees and started again. I repeated this down the taper once or twice, and that started to give me a rough dome. Then I moved back to that final line and made some shallow cuts just to ease the shape in a little. To finish, it was back to the rasp, file and sandpaper. To cut a slot to hold the tail, I stacked up some scraps of wood until the saw blade ran across the centre. In hindsight, it might have been a bit better to temporarily glue these together with a glue gun, but it worked after a fashion. And I finished cleaning out the slot with some sandpaper on the back of the saw blade. To mark out for the hardware, I used some narrow gaffer tape which doesn't distort, and made a centre line from the nose to the midpoint of the slot. I added 3 marks for weights and 2 for hook hangers, using guesswork rather than a plan. To hold the layer blank securely in the bench hook, I used an offcut of board which I'd clamped down, then tapped it until it gripped the layer. I drilled all the holes out with the 3mm pilot bit. And then for the weight holes, I went back with an 8mm drill, taking it down to about half the thickness of the wood. To make the eyes that carry the hooks and the hitch point, I wanted to experiment with a slightly different approach. So I cut some short lengths of 1mm stainless steel wire and shaped the eye using a pair of jewellery pliers. Then I clamped this to the bench and mounted the ends of the wire in the chuck of a hand drill, and pulling back, spiralled up the wire. To fit them, I mixed up some 5-minute epoxy and used a piping bag I made from some snap-lock plastic bags. This really filled the holes and I could push the eyes into place. I then mixed up some more resin and wiped a thin coat onto the bare wood to seal it. I repeated this about half an hour later. After adding the hooks, I realised that my lack of a plan meant they were a little too close together and would probably spend a fair amount of time tangled. So I pulled out the rear hook hanger, which took a little more grunt than I was expecting. Despite being 5-minute epoxy, it still normally needs a good 24 hours to get to full strength, and these eyes had only been in for about an hour. I fitted another eye nearer the tail, out of harm's way. For weights, I used some plumber's solder and melted it into the 3 holes that I'd guessed at. This turned out to be not quite enough to sink the lure, so I added the tail. I'd cut this from a silicone baking sheet that I picked up from my least favourite store. The template was something I quickly drew up on the computer. It still wasn't enough to sink the lure, so I added another weight hole nearer the front and filled it, capping it with some hot glue just as a temporary measure. And then things looked a little better, but I planned to add weight to the leader if I needed to get to some deeper spots when I was out fishing. To finish the holes, I headed outside to use some stinky 2-part wood filler, which dries quickly and rock hard, so I could sand it flush. To paint the lure, I mounted it in a fly tying vise and started out by putting down a base coat of artist's acrylic, which is low odour and dries quickly with a little help from a heat gun. Then it was time to get the airbrush out, which, having been a good while since I'd used it last, I was more than a little rusty. But I went for simple stripes, looking to make something like a fire tiger pattern with a little bit of pink. For the stripes, I used an acrylic marker and made it up as I went along. The eyes I punched out of some sticky back holographic sheet from a craft shop and added some cartoon pupils with an acrylic marker. After leaving the paint overnight to dry, I added a couple of layers of slow curing epoxy while the body was turning on a rack to prevent runs. To keep the slot open on the back, I pushed a piece of folded silicone sheet into the gap. After a couple of days, when the resin had hardened, I replaced the temporary piece of silicone with the tail folded over and used a screw eye I'd cut down to hold it in place. This also meant I could change the tail if it got damaged. It's absolutely lashing it down. I'm just hiding out under a tree. I think it's going to pass in a minute and I can get back to it. With a few showers under my belt and changing swims a couple of times, I managed to find a good sized pike, although the camera work was a bit patchy. The rain was finally moved on by the wind, which slowly turned into a gale, but in a sheltered spot I gave the lure a bit of a test swim and was surprised to find it was a little unbalanced, although it didn't actually roll over. Changing to a spare tail which had a wide fin that tapered towards the end really kept the action all in the tail, and leaving this on I picked up another smaller jack pike as the sun came out. But all that rain, wind and weed had begun to turn the lake into a mucky soup, so I headed home with a smile wide enough for two faces. To be honest, I don't think I'm done with broom handle lures, so if you have some suggestions for more baits, leave them in the comments and I'll have a go at seeing how many I can make out of one pole for another video. And while I'm being honest, I do need your support to continue making these videos, so if you'd like to contribute with an ongoing donation, follow the link to my Patreon page, and thanks for watching.